Director of the Adelaide Institute for Sleep Health. So his research is focused on identifying causes for sleep apnea, optimising existing therapies, and also developing new therapies using novel respiratory phenotyping techniques. I think not too many of us would know about that. That will have to do a different science forum on that day. So Danny has authored 120 peer-reviewed publications in leading research journals. So please welcome Danny.
Many thanks, Carol, for the kind introduction and invitation to be here, and Tim and the rest of the team. This is a great event, bringing my two worlds together, cycling and sleep. So this was really fun. I'm going to talk about two things this evening. I'm going to start with some sleep facts and myths, and then the remainder of my brief presentation will be on the role of sleep and exercise performance, and in particular, what goes bad when you don't sleep enough, and how the physiological benefits from getting good sleep, and how that might benefit exercise performance. I just ask everyone to think about this question. How many hours do you typically sleep per night?
Not enough.
Just have a little think about that, on average. And look down the list here. And I'll ask you just to do a show of hands as we go through. So how many people would say they sleep on a regular basis less than 5 hours per night? What about 5 to 6 is your regular? Yep. 6 to 7? Yeah, good bunch there. 7 to 8. Majority. 8 to 9. And who gets more than 9 hours a night on a regular basis? I'm afraid to say this. So, look, I could put up any statistic here, but this is probably the most crucial one. This is your mortality, risk of premature mortality. So for those of you who are down this end, saying that 6 or 7 hours a night, these are, when you ask that question to literally millions of people, and you track that over time, you are much more likely to die early. But interestingly, up this end, the same is also true. So if you sleep 9 or more, and perhaps we're embarrassed to say that for other reasons, for reasons we don't really understand, you're also at increased risk of dying, and that may be related to other comorbidities. And the sweet spot is in that sort of 7 or 8 zone we would see. Here are actually the recommendations. Sleep requirements change across the lifespan, but for a healthy adult, aged it's 20 and above or thereabouts, 7 to 9 hours. And interestingly, in an older age, your sleep requirements don't change that much. You still need that sort of 7 or 8 hours a night. Sleep quality changes a little, but you still have similar sleep requirements. I've just put this question up because I'll come back to it when I'm showing the evidence, but do endurance athletes require more sleep? Just have a think about that as we go through. Turns out many Australians don't get enough sleep. 4 out of 10 have insufficient sleep, and this costs the country about $66 billion a year conservatively. So it's a huge issue. And so much so that last year we had a parliamentary inquiry on sleep health of the nation. Hopefully some things to be done in that area now. So I'm just going to ask another question about what we know about sleep. So how many times do you think a healthy 20-year-old individual wakes up per hour of sleep?
Per hour?
Yeah, so just think about that. Would it be 0? Would it be quite normal? 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, or greater than 15. So who thinks we wake up, we shouldn't be waking up if we're healthy 20 at all? A. Yep, she there. Who thinks maybe 1 to 5 times an hour is normal? Yep, majority. 5 to 10? Some. 10 to 15? Greater than 15. Yep.
You're talking about being conscious?
Good question. So here's the answer. So when you measure the brain waves when people are asleep, here's the data across several studies with the darker line shown here. These are brief awakenings. So no, you will not be aware of the majority of these brief awakenings. They're happening 5, 10, 15 seconds at a time. And in answer to the question, the correct answer is D, which we had 0 show of hands. But for a 20-year-old down here, it's completely normal to wake up 10 to 15 times per hour. So just sort of dispelling that myth that this, you go off to sleep, you comatose. This is a very dynamic process that we're going through. And in fact, if you're a healthy 50-year-old, you're waking up 20 times an hour, quite normal. All right, so there, just to wet your palate with those ones. I'm now going to talk about, what about sleep and exercise performance? We love our bikes, we love our gizmos, and some of them would like to take the bed in this way. But it is sleep is the best medicine there is. Quite simply, it is the process that restores every cell in the body overnight, and it has profound effects on the human body. Every cell in the body, in fact, or certainly every organ, is adversely affected if you're not getting adequate sleep or if it's disrupted due to a sleep disorder. So I'll just give you some couple of examples here. Look at the list there. There's many in terms of your cognitive function. Turns out that when you're in deep sleep, that's when, throughout the day we're learning all these processes and new information. That information is reinforced and strengthened, particularly during deep sleep. So here's that, here's the word cycling there, but cycling in a different manner, very dynamic state. So in fact, when you're in rapid eye movement sleep, if we measure your brain waves, we cannot tell if you're awake or asleep. Very, very active. So there's a lot going on there, and it turns out you're consolidating your memories and the things you learned throughout the day. If you don't get any sleep, if you're sleep deprived, your amygdala, this area of the brain that's sort of involved with your decision making and emotional reactions, if you like, is 60% more reactive. So you're more likely to make rash, harsh decisions. So you can imagine what that is like in a peloton. If someone hasn't slept, they're more likely to be breaking away every 2 seconds and causing grief. Growth hormone, almost exclusively released during sleep. And in particular, the first part of sleep and deep sleep. So growth hormone is essential for muscle repair and rejuvenation and many things. So, and you can see here in the sleep deprived state, you are not getting that big burst of growth hormone if you're depriving someone of sleep. So clearly very important for that hormonal effect. Most of the things I'm going to talk about happened either in Adelaide or somewhere in Australia because that's where the best research in the planet happens. So this was a really influential study from Drew Dawson's group here in Adelaide. And basically what he did was compare the effects of sleep deprivation on alertness and function in relation to alcohol impairment. So if you stay awake for 24 hours, you're basically 0.1 blood alcohol concentration equivalent. So, double the legal limit. If you're awake for 19 hours in a row, you're at borderline 0.05. So, you can see what these effects are sort of having in terms of your ability to react. Here's some other sort of alarming studies, if you like. If you take a healthy 20-year-old, put them in the lab and restrict them for 5 nights in a row to 5 hours per night, and you measure or up to a week, and you measure their blood glucose level. They are now, that healthy individual is now at a pre-diabetic state, just from those 5 nights in a row. If you do the same and you now measure testosterone, it's as though you've aged a decade during that same regime. So these are very powerful effects on the human body. And maybe society would be better if guys were getting less sleep and less testosterone flying around. But certainly from exercise performance and your competitive edge and your ability to perform, not what we're looking for. And again, some of this work was conducted here in Adelaide. So in actual fact, it's like this bidirectional relationship, and we know this, and I won't show you the data, but if, endurance sport, unless you're doing it right before you go off to sleep, makes you sleep better. You get deeper sleep, and that, has this sort of beneficial bidirectional relationship here. So, and sleep can obviously improve your performance, as I'll show you. So, I mentioned those things, throughout the day we're learning all these things, and basically at night a garbage truck comes along, cleans up our brain and all the rest of it, takes the things we don't need. But in the peloton, when you're trying to make in a grand tour, for example, when you're trying to learn, about your opponents and subtle moves, turns out that all that learning process happens while you're asleep. So this is actually a study, very recent, where they reversed the handlebars, and so that when you turn left, the wheel went right. And they tried to teach this to people, and it turns out you're only good at learning that particular gross motor skill, as it's called here, after you've had some sleep. That's when those consolidation of memories and new learnings happen. And run to the end, so I'll skip through. Don't get enough sleep, bad on your endurance performance. A night of sleep deprivation is a big problem. But it also turns out that, and this is a really neat study, again from Australia, they did the two arms, normal sleep, so they tracked their sleep, what their normal sleep was in the week before, they gave them normal sleep on one night, they reduced it by 30% on one other occasion, and then they increased it by 30%. And it turns out your endurance performance got better when you had that 30% extra of what was normal for you. So getting back to that original question, yes, there is some evidence that athletes need more sleep than other individuals. Turns out athletes have a lot of sleep problems, particularly around competition and anxiety before races. So a lot of them, this is actually a review of many different studies put together, but roughly half of athletes, endurance, high performance endurance athletes report having issues around their sleep and not sleeping well. So this is a big problem in this context. How does it work? Well, it turns out, if you're doing a VO2 max test and you ask someone, at different levels throughout that test, how are you going? How do you feel? What's your perceived exertion level? That's a really good marker of when they're about to blow and run out of juice. So what happens when you're sleep deprived is you are much more sensitive to those yucky feelings that we all have when we're riding a bike fast. So you're more heightened, and in the same way that if you don't get enough sleep, it increases your pain sensitivity. So poor sleep, and I've talked about that bidirectional relationship. So if you're sleeping poorly, you're much more likely to experience heightened sensations of pain, and that will then have this reciprocal relationship where that causes further poor sleep. And basically, that's what you're doing when you're riding a bike fast. You just, the ability to suffer is what we're after, and effectively you are less able to do that when you're not sleeping enough. Okay, and the last thing I'm just going to finish on here is, Jamie told us about high altitude and the effects that can have on performance. Again, I've listed some Australian collaborators here. There's actually a lot of data on this now, and some quite nice randomised trials have come out in the last few years. And absolutely, you can get an improvement in your endurance performance in the order of about 2 to 5% on average if you train high. And this particular summary was in runners. Elite athletes that go up to those levels, it's more like a 1%. It's a marginal, but this is it's a marginal game that we're in to try and get that extra edge. So it is there. You have one night, you don't sleep, 10% loss or more in your endurance performance. So just to put, you go for 4 weeks, you get that 1% if you're lucky on average. One night, don't get any sleep, 10% loss. So this is a powerful effect. So sporting teams, others are thinking about this now. Recovery, Jamie mentioned, there's only a certain amount of hours a day when you do and ability to exercise. A lot of energy should be going into actually turning off and getting a rest. And lastly, just on that, when I was in Boston, I had a woman who was in the national Canadian team for triathlete, a friend. She came and stayed and was doing some racing, and she brought one of these things with her, one of these hypoxic tents who are out there, and I was like, what are you doing that for? And it was for those reasons, to get those edges. And I guess just as a cautionary note, my colleagues in Boston down the hall at the hospital I worked at were doing other studies where they did this for up to a month. And it turns out, a month it raises your blood pressure, it has other effects in the cardiovascular system, and it mucks up your sleep. So, I just thought that was an interesting caveat to keep in mind. So maybe a little bit of dose of stressing the system is okay, but too much, you might go south and it starts impairing the sleep. Anyone, if they get high enough, they'll get sleep apnea if you go too high. So you'll get what's called central sleep apnea. I've spoken for too long, so I'll finish now, Rachel. But I just want to thank my fantastic team at the Adelaide Institute for Sleep Health. as you can see, they're a happy, healthy, well slept bunch.